The year was 1877, and the silence in Esther Shaw's cabin was a physical thing, as heavy and suffocating as the dust motes that danced in the slivers of autumn light. It had settled in the corners and clung to the rough-hewn timbers the day her mother had drawn her last, quiet breath, and it had not left since. The cabin itself stood apart from the raw settlement of Promise Creek, perched on a rise, as if it, too, were an outcast. Below, the town was a wound of muddy streets and false-fronted buildings gouged into the vast, indifferent prairie. The land itself held its breath, a sweeping expanse of dun-colored grasses that sighed under a sky too large for any one person's grief. Esther was a creature of this silence now. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of the cabin, the rhythmic dip and pull of her needle, and the gnawing ache of a loneliness so profound it felt like a second skin. Her mother, Martha, had been her sun and moon, the source of every story, every meal, every lesson in the art that now provided Esther's meager living. It was Martha who had taught her how to read the language of fabric, to understand the tension of a seam, the gentle give of wool, the stubborn pride of good linen. Now, Esther mended the torn shirts of miners and the frayed dresses of the town's few respectable women, her fingers moving with a memory that her heart could no longer bear to access fully. The coins they paid her were scant, offered with a grim reluctance that spoke of their disapproval. She was the strange woman on the hill, too quiet, too solitary, her grief a shroud they could not penetrate and therefore did not trust. Her days bled into one another in a watercolor wash of grey monotony. She would rise, force down a piece of dry bread, and work until the light failed. She rationed everything: flour, lamp oil, the very words she might have spoken if there had been anyone to hear. Her only luxury, her only tether to the woman she had lost, was a single spool of thread that sat on the mantelpiece. It was her mother's last. It was not cotton or silk, but something finer, spun from a material neither of them had ever been able to name, purchased from a traveling peddler years ago. It shone with an iridescent quality, like moonlight captured on a spider's web, and it was impossibly strong. Martha had saved it for a special occasion that never came. For Esther, it was more than thread. It was the final, tangible piece of her mother's presence, a repository of unspoken love and deferred dreams. To use it would be a betrayal, a final severing. The routine was shattered on a Tuesday. The wind had a sharp edge to it, carrying the first promise of a winter that would be long and cruel. A shadow fell across her doorway, so sudden and complete it felt as if the sun had been eclipsed. Esther looked up from the collar she was turning, her needle freezing mid-stitch. A man stood there, framed by the pale light. He was Lakota, tall and broad-shouldered, his face a mask of stoic lines carved by sun and hardship. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple shirt, but his bearing was that of a man who answered to no one. He did not look at her with the pity or suspicion she received from the townsfolk, but with a flat, assessing gaze that missed nothing. He carried something bundled in soft hide. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, he stepped inside, the scent of wood smoke and pine filling the small space. He laid the bundle on her work table. It was a robe, a magnificent garment of buffalo hide, tanned to the softness of velvet and decorated with intricate lines of quillwork and beads that told a story she could not read, but its beauty was marred. A long, vicious tear ran diagonally across the back, a wound that had ripped through hide and decoration alike. "The chiefs," the man said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. He used the English words carefully, as if they were foreign objects in his mouth. Tashunka. The name was known even in Promise Creek, spoken in hushed and fearful tones. Tashunka was the leader of the people who lived in the hills beyond the river, a man of power and pride who kept his distance from the white settlers. The warrior pointed a finger at the tear. Mend. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at Esther's skin. This was not a miner's shirt. This was something sacred. The townspeople would be furious, terrified, if they knew. They saw the Lakota as a threat, a danger to be contained. To work for them was to cross a line, to invite condemnation and exile. But poverty was its own kind of threat, more immediate and just as deadly. She saw the offering the man carried in his other hand, a stack of thick, valuable beaver pelts, and a pouch that she knew would be filled with dried meat. It was more than she could earn in 2 months. It was survival. She swallowed, her throat dry. "I will need to see if I have the means." It was a weak protest, but the only one she could muster. The warrior simply nodded, his eyes fixed on her. The silence that followed was not empty, but filled with the weight of his expectation. He moved back to the doorway and stood there, a sentinel guarding a tomb, waiting for her decision. Esther's world, once so small and contained, had just been breached. She was being asked not just to mend a robe, but to stitch together 2 worlds that wanted nothing more than to remain apart, and the needle she would have to use was her own terrified heart. Esther carried the robe to her work table, her hands trembling slightly as she spread it out. The weight of it was surprising, a solid, earthy presence in her sparse cabin. The hide was supple, worn smooth with time and use, yet it smelled of the open sky. She ran her fingers along the tier, her professional instincts overriding her fear for a moment. It was a clean rip, likely from a snag on a sharp branch, but it had sliced through a complex pattern of blue and white beads. To repair it would require more than just skill. It would require artistry and a profound respect for the original craftsman's work. She looked to the doorway. The Lakota man remained, a statue of patience, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if her small cabin were merely a temporary interruption in his view of the world. His presence was a constant pressure, a reminder that this was no ordinary task, this was a test. She went to her small chest of supplies, her heart sinking with each spool she examined. Her threads were good, sturdy cotton and linen fit for denim and calico. But against the rich, dark hide of the chief's robe, they looked coarse and pale, like ugly scars. They would hold the tear, yes, but they would deface the garment, announcing the repair as a clumsy intrusion. She could not do it. Her pride as a seamstress, the one thing her grief had not yet managed to extinguish, would not allow it. Her eyes drifted to the mantelpiece, to the single, shimmering spool. Her mother's thread. A knot of anguish tightened in her chest. The thought of using it felt like a sacrilege. It was the last whisper of her mother's voice in this silent house. It was meant for a wedding dress that would never be sewn, for a christening gown for a grandchild she would never hold. It was for their future, a future that had died with Martha Shaw. But what was the alternative? To refuse the work was to invite the warrior's scorn and, more practically, to embrace starvation. To do a poor job was to risk not just scorn, but anger. This robe was clearly more than just clothing. It was a symbol of a man's authority, his history, his very soul. To mend it poorly would be a greater insult than to refuse entirely. The wind howled outside, rattling the single window pane like a restless spirit. It sounded like her own indecision given voice. She looked from the thread to the robe, and then to the silent man in the doorway. He was not just a warrior, he was a man from a people who understood symbols, who saw the spirit in things. Perhaps they would understand the spirit in this thread. The thought was a strange one, unbidden and foreign, but it settled in her mind. Maybe this was the special occasion her mother had been waiting for. Not one of joy, but one of necessity, of honor. A task that required the very best she had to give. With a hand that felt disconnected from her body, she reached up and took the spool from the mantle. It felt cool and smooth in her palm. In the dim light, its pearlescent sheen seemed to pulse with a soft life of its own. She threaded her finest needle, the steel a sliver of cold against her warm fingers. She took a deep, steadying breath, the air tasting of dust and resolve, and bent over the chief's robe. She worked for hours. The world outside her cabin faded away. There was only the feel of the soft hide, the sharp point of her needle, and the whisper of the thread as she pulled it through. She did not merely sew the tear, she rewove it. Her stitches were tiny and precise, following the grain of the leather, disappearing into the hide. Where the beads had been torn away, she used the thread to create a delicate, looping pattern that did not replace the old one but seemed to honor its absence, like a lovingly tended scar. The thread behaved unlike any she had ever used. It was pliant, yet unbreakably strong, and it seemed to catch the light in a way that made the repair almost invisible from one angle, and from another, shine with a faint, silvery luminescence. It was as if she was stitching the torn edges together with liquid moonlight. When she was finished, the sun was low in the sky, painting the prairie in hues of bruised purple and soft orange. Her back ached and her eyes burned from the strain, but the robe was whole again. The tear was gone, replaced by a seam so fine it looked less like a repair and more like a vein of silver ore that had always been part of the landscape of the hide. She folded it carefully and carried it to the doorway. The warrior turned his head, his impassive expression unchanged. She held it out to him. He took it without a word and unfolded it, his eyes immediately finding her work. He ran a rough finger over the seam, his touch surprisingly gentle. He held it up to the dying light, turning it back and forth. For a long moment he was utterly still. Then, a flicker of something awe, surprise, respect crossed his face, as brief and as startling as a flash of lightning on a clear night. It was the first crack in his stoic facade. He looked from the robe to her face, and for the first time his gaze was not merely assessing, it was questioning, as if he was seeing not just a poor seamstress, but something more. He nodded, a single sharp gesture of approval that felt more profound than a stream of praise. He placed the pouch of dried meat and the stack of pelts at her feet, a trove of wealth that made her dizzy. It was more than they had agreed upon. It was not just payment, it was a tribute. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the twilight as silently as he had arrived. Esther stood in the doorway, the cool evening air on her face, clutching the empty spool in her hand. It felt impossibly light. The days that followed were different. The specter of hunger receded from Esther's cabin, replaced by the savory scent of roasting meat and the security of the pelts stacked in the corner, a promise of trade for flour and oil. But the change was more than just practical. The silence in the cabin felt different too. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of pure loss, but a quieter, more watchful kind of stillness. She had used her mother's thread. She had survived the test. Something had shifted, both inside her and in the world outside her door. A week later, they came. She saw them from her window, two figures approaching not from the direction of the town, but from the river. One was the chief himself, Tashunka. He walked with a deep-chested authority, the mended robe draped over his shoulders. In the morning sun, her repair was invisible, seamlessly integrated into the whole. The man beside him was older, his face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, his long, white hair braided with otter fur. No, not a man. It was a woman, an elder whose eyes held the calm, deep wisdom of a forest pool. Esther's heart hammered against her ribs. She smoothed her apron with trembling hands and opened the door before they reached it, a small gesture of welcome that cost her a great deal of courage. Tashunka stopped before her. He was an imposing figure, radiating a quiet power that seemed to emanate from the very land he stood upon. He looked directly at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He spoke, his voice low and resonant, but the words were in his own tongue, the sounds as natural and flowing as water over stones. The old woman stepped forward slightly. "He gives you his thanks," she said, her English clear and accented with a soft, melodic cadence. "My name is Winona. I speak for him and for our people." It was an honor to work on the robe, Esther managed, her voice barely a whisper. Winona's eyes, bright and intelligent, glanced at the robe on Tashunka's shoulders. "It is more than work. We saw the thread." She looked back at Esther, her gaze intense. "It does not just join, it heals. It has a spirit, a strength that is not of this world." Esther felt a flush of confusion. To her, it had been a fine thread and a difficult job. To them, it was magic. It was just a special thread, my mother's. The admission was quiet, intensely personal. A look of understanding dawned on Winona's face. She translated Esther's words to Tashunka, who listened intently, his gaze never leaving Esther's. "A mother's spirit," Winona said, nodding slowly. "Yes, we felt it. The robe is a part of him. It carries the story of his life, his father's life. To wound the robe is to wound him. You have made him whole again." This was a language of meaning Esther had almost forgotten. In Promise Creek, a tear was a flaw, a sign of poverty or carelessness. Here, it was a wound to a man's spirit, and its mending was an act of healing. A flicker of connection, fragile and tentative, sparked within her. She was not just a mender of cloth to these people. She was something more. "Your skill is a gift," Winona continued. "A great gift." Tashunka spoke again, a short phrase. He reached into a pouch at his waist and brought out a small beaded amulet on a leather cord. It was crafted in the shape of a dragonfly, its wings a shimmering blue. He held it out to her. "He says your fingers dance like the dragonfly over water," Winona explained, "quick and light, and creating beauty where there was none. He asks you to accept this so that we may know you as a friend." Esther stared at the gift, her throat thick with emotion. No one had called her a friend in years. No one had seen beauty in what she did, only utility. With a hesitant hand, she reached out and took the amulet. The beads were cool against her skin. It was the second time in as many weeks that she had been paid, not just in goods, but in respect. As her fingers closed around the small dragonfly, she felt the ice around her heart begin to crack. She was still isolated on her hill, but for the first time since her mother's passing, she did not feel entirely alone. The fragile piece of Esther's new reality was not destined to last. Promise Creek was a town that thrived on suspicion, and secrets could not long be kept in such a small, tightly wound place. Her transaction with the Lakota warrior had been seen. The subsequent visit from the chief himself was an event of seismic proportions, discussed in hushed, fearful whispers over the counters of the general store and in the pews of the stark white church. The change in the town's attitude was palpable. Before, she had been an object of pity and mild distrust, the grieving recluse on the hill. Now, she was a collaborator, a traitor. The women who had once given her their mending now crossed the street to avoid her, their faces pinched with condemnation. When she went to the general store for flour, Mr. Callahan, a man with a perpetually sour expression and narrow, judgmental eyes, served the customers on either side of her before finally turning to her. "We don't have what you need," he said flatly, his arms crossed over his chest. "I can see the sack of flour right behind you, Mr. Callahan," Esther replied, her voice steady despite the furious pounding of her heart. "That's reserved," he sniffed. "Don't serve your kind here. Go get what you need from your new friends in the hills." The sneer in his voice was unmistakable. He was casting her out, drawing a line in the dust of his floorboards. Shamed and furious, Esther turned and left the store, the eyes of the other patrons boring into her back. The door swung shut behind her, sealing her exile. She retreated back to her cabin, the small dragonfly amulet tucked beneath her collar, a secret source of warmth against her skin. The town's rejection was a bitter pill, but the memory of Winona's respectful gaze and Tashunka's quiet dignity provided a strange and unexpected antidote. She had food. She had pelts for trade in a larger town, if need be. She would survive. But a new and far more urgent problem was unfolding in the hills beyond the river. As the days shortened and the cold deepened, Winona appeared at her door again. This time, her wise face was etched with a deep and profound worry. She carried a small blanket, worn thin and frayed at the edges. "The cold comes early this year," Winona said, her voice heavy. "And a sickness has come with it. It touches the children first. It settles in their chests. They are weak." She held up the threadbare blanket. Our coverings are old. They cannot keep out the bite of the wind. We are losing the fight. Esther took the blanket. It was beautifully woven, with geometric patterns that spoke of a skilled hand, but it was frail, offering as much warmth as a spider web. She understood immediately. It wasn't just the cold. It was the damp, the relentless chill that seeped into the bones and lungs, that gave fevers a foothold. We need new blankets, new winter wraps for the little ones, Winona continued, her eyes pleading with an intensity that pierced Esther's soul. We have the wool, the hides, but we lack the knowledge to weave them in a way that will trap the warmth, that will be strong enough to turn away the frost. The old ways of doing it are being lost. Our weavers are gone. She paused, taking a deep breath. But you know the secrets of the thread. You made the chief's robe whole again with a spirit in your stitches. Our council has spoken. We believe you are the one who can teach us, the one who can weave a future for our children. The weight of her words settled on Esther, heavier than any stone. They were not asking for a simple mending job. They were asking her to save them. They were asking the outcast, the silent woman on the hill, to become their teacher, their hope against the coming winter. The sheer, impossible scale of it stole her breath. What did she know of their ways? What did she know of weaving blankets against a killing frost? She was a seamstress, a mender of what was already made, not a creator of life-sustaining things. I don't know how, she stammered, the truth a painful admission of her own inadequacy. I'm a seamstress. I work with cloth. I don't weave it. Winona's gaze did not waver. You know how to make things strong. You know how to make seams that hold. You see the way things must fit together to become more than their parts. This is the same knowledge. The spirit that guides your needle can guide the loom. We will learn alongside you. She placed a hand on Esther's arm, her touch surprisingly firm. We do not ask you to do this alone. We ask you to share your gift. Tashunka says you have a strong heart. He believes in you. The conflict tore through Esther. On one side was the hostile town, a place that had already cast her out, that would surely seek to punish her for this ultimate act of allegiance with the Lakota. Stones had already been thrown at her cabin one night, clattering against the roof like hard, bitter rain. On the other side was a people's desperate plea. The images of sick children, their small bodies racked with coughs in the freezing dark, rose in her mind. It was a choice between her own safety and the survival of innocence. The weight of it was crushing, but in the end there was no real choice at all. How could she hoard her small skill, her meager knowledge, when lives hung in the balance? I will try, Esther said, the words feeling small and inadequate, but costing her everything. I will help. A wave of relief washed over Winona's face, so profound it seemed to erase some of the lines of worry. The spirits will honor this, she said softly. You will not be forgotten. As Winona departed, the first flakes of snow began to fall, tiny and white against the grey sky. They were a beautiful, terrifying promise of the trial to come. Esther stood at her window, watching them land, feeling as if she was standing on a precipice between two warring worlds, with the fate of one of them resting in her own two trembling hands. The nights grew longer and colder, each one a testament to the urgency of their task. By an unspoken agreement, the work took place at Esther's cabin. It was a neutral space, a bridge between worlds. Each morning, a small group of Lakota women, led by Winona, would make the trek from their camp, bringing sheared wool, tanned hides, and a quiet determination that humbled Esther. At first, the work was clumsy and fraught with challenges. Esther, a master of the needle, found herself a fumbling student of the loom. She had a small, rickety frame her mother had used for weaving patches, and on this she tried to demonstrate the principles of a tight warp and a dense weft. The Lakota women were patient, their hands, so skilled at beading and quill work, struggling to adapt to this new rhythm. Language was a barrier, bridged by Winona's translations and by the universal language of hands, demonstrating a technique of shared frustration at a tangled thread, of a small, mutual smile at a well-made row. Esther discovered a deep well of forgotten knowledge within herself, memories of her mother explaining the way different fibers behaved, how a double weave could create pockets of air for warmth. She was not just teaching, she was learning, excavating her own past. The silence of her cabin was broken by the rhythmic clatter of the loom, the soft murmur of the women's voices, the occasional, startling sound of her own laughter. The grief for her mother did not vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer a suffocating shroud, but a warm blanket of memory, woven now with purpose and companionship. But as life blossomed inside the cabin, hatred festered outside it. The sight of the Lakota women coming and going from Esther's home was a daily affront to the people of Promise Creek. Her cabin became a symbol of everything they feared and despised. The threats escalated from muttered curses on the street to something more sinister. A dead raven was left on her doorstep, a grim and ugly omen. One evening, a rock shattered her only window, spraying glass and the frigid night air into the room where they worked. The women startled, but under Winona's calm gaze, they swept up the glass, and one of them quietly stretched a piece of hide over the opening, and they returned to their weaving. Their resilience was a silent, powerful rebuke to the town's venom. The climax arrived on a moonless, bitterly cold night. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin, a keening sound that seemed to mock their efforts. Inside, a small fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Esther and 3 of the women were working late, trying to finish a thick, warm blanket for a child whose cough had grown worse. Suddenly, the sound of angry shouts cut through the howl of the wind. They were close, men's voices, slurred with cheap whiskey and fueled by righteous hatred. Esther's blood ran cold. She peered through a crack in the door and saw Thema 6 men from the town, led by Mr. Callahan's hulking son, Arthur. They carried torches, the flames licking at the darkness like hungry tongues. "Come on out, Indian lover," Arthur Callahan roared. "We're gonna burn this nest of filth to the ground." Panic seized Esther. She was trapped. The women behind her fell silent, their faces grim but resolute. There was nowhere to run. The men were circling the cabin, their shadows monstrous and distorted in the torchlight. They were shouting vile things, their words poisoning the air. Esther backed away from the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it. This was the price of her choice. Just as Arthur Callahan raised his torch, preparing to thrust it into the dry timber of the wall, a new silence fell. It was not the absence of sound, but the arrival of a presence so commanding it swallowed all other noise. Out of the darkness they emerged. Tashunka and a dozen of his warriors, materializing as if from the earth itself. They were on foot, armed with bows and lances, but their greatest weapon was their stillness. They formed a silent, unbreachable ring around the cabin, their bodies a living wall between Esther and the mob. The townsmen froze, their drunken bravado evaporating in the face of this deadly, silent opposition. Arthur Callahan stammered, his torch wavering in his hand. Tashunka stepped forward into the flickering light. The mended robe was on his shoulders, the faint, silvery line of her mother's thread seeming to catch the firelight. He did not look at the frightened men from the town. His eyes were fixed on the cabin door. "Wachiwi," his voice rang out clear and powerful, cutting through the tense air. The name was a shield, a declaration. Hearing him, feeling the solidness of his presence, something inside Esther shifted. The terror receded, replaced by a surge of fierce, defiant courage. She had been hiding and cowering for too long. She had made her choice. Now she would stand by it. With a steady hand, she unlatched the door and pulled it open. She did not shrink behind the frame. She stepped out into the cold night air, into the space between the mob and the warriors. She walked until she stood not behind Tashunka, but beside him. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting Arthur Callahan's, unwavering and unafraid. Her action was her answer. It was a treaty signed in the face of fire and hate. Tashunka glanced at her, a brief, almost imperceptible nod of approval in his eyes. He turned his formidable gaze upon the townsman. He said nothing more. He did not need to. The image was more powerful than any threat. The Lakota chief and the pale seamstress, standing together, a united front against the darkness. The men from Promise Creek saw it. They saw their own drunken foolishness reflected in the warriors' steady eyes. They saw the end of their power. Muttering, avoiding eye contact, they began to back away. Arthur Callahan was the last to go, casting one final venomous look before turning and stumbling after his friends, his torch leaving a trail of smoke in the frigid air. They melted back into the night, defeated not by violence, but by a quiet, unshakable solidarity. The threat was gone. In the ringing silence that remained, Esther stood tall, the cold air on her face feeling, for the first time, like freedom. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the world settled into a new shape. The line between Esther's cabin and the Lakota camp dissolved, and the path between them became a well-worn track of purpose and belonging. The town of Promise Creek receded in her mind, a bitter memory that lost its power with each passing day. Her exile had become her liberation. It was Winona who told her what the name Tashunka had called her meant. Wachiwi, she explained, her eyes crinkling at the corners. It can mean dancing woman, but in this way, it means woman who makes, or she who creates. He has given you a name that honors the spirit of your work. Esther moved her few precious belongings to the camp. They gave her a lodge of her own, near Winona's, but she spent most of her time in the large central lodge that had been converted into a workshop. The small, rickety loom from her cabin was joined by larger, sturdier frames built by the men. The space, once quiet, now buzzed with the life she had craved for so long. It was filled with the rhythmic thump of the looms, the soft scraping of cards through wool, the murmur of women's voices sharing stories, and the bright, surprising sound of shared laughter. She was no longer just a teacher, but a student as well. She learned the meanings behind the Lakota patterns, the symbol for the mountains, the sign for running water, the diamond shape that represented the eye of the Great Spirit watching over them. Her own precise, practical skills merged with their deep, symbolic artistry. Together, they did not just weave blankets, they wove prayers. They created garments that were not just warm, but beautiful, each one a testament to their collective resilience. Her skill, once a solitary practice for meager coins, had found its true calling, not to patch the old, but to create the new, to wrap a community in warmth and hope. The relationship between her and Tashunka evolved, settling into a deep, quiet understanding that transcended the need for many words. It was built on a foundation of mutual respect. He would often stop by the weaving lodge, not to inspect the work, but simply to watch for a moment, his presence a silent affirmation of its importance. He saw in her a strength that matched his own, a spirit that would not break. And she saw in him a leader whose first duty was to his people, a man whose quietness masked a profound depth of care. Their bond was not one of fiery passion, but of two solitary souls who had found in each other an unexpected harbor. The first deep snows of winter finally came, blanketing the land in a thick, pristine silence. The sickness in the camp had receded, driven back by warmth and better nourishment. The children, wrapped in the new, thick blankets, played in the snow, their laughter bright against the white landscape. The weaving was done. The tribe was ready. One evening, Esther sat by the fire in Tashunka's lodge, sharing a meal with him and Winona. She was wrapped in a blanket of her own making, the wool soft and warm against her skin. The pattern was a simple one, a border of blue dragonfly motifs against a field of creamy white. It was a fusion of her past and her present. The firelight danced across their faces, casting a warm, golden glow. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, there was only peace. She thought of the iridescent spool of thread, her mother's last gift. The thread itself was gone, its final inches used up weeks ago, but she understood now that its magic was not in the filament itself. The magic was in the act of giving it away. It had been a thread of connection, and in using it to mend the robe of a stranger, she had allowed it to weave her into the fabric of a new life, a new family. Her grief for her mother had not disappeared, but it had found its place, a single shimmering thread in a much larger, more beautiful tapestry. She had lost a home, but she had found her people. Looking into the calm, steady eyes of the chief across the fire, Esther Shaw, the woman now known as Wachiwi, knew she was finally where she belonged.